Ba-dum, bum, psh, bum, ba-dum, psh, bum, bum, psh, dum, ba-dum, psh. Here we go, Sam Harris. Here we go, Jordan B. Peterson. Hey yo, who is this guy? What does he have to say about anything? What?
Forces of evil and a Bozo nightmare. Ban all the music with a phony gas chamber, cause one's got a weasel and other's got a flag. One's on the pole, shut the other in the bag.
Oh, thank you. Right. So here we are. It's gonna be me. It's me again. It's gonna be a paint and slow mangled critique of the Sam Harris, Jordan B. Peterson nightmare. We call like old school logic functions. Let's begin some of this nonsense where we can see the almighty Sam Harris not stumble. I gotta respect it. I gotta respect them both. What's not to respect? But let's see what this is all about. This nonsense and non-such. Okay. Let's get this fully loaded here.
Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris.
Fine.
Well, today I am speaking with a guest who many of you may not have heard of. He is a clinical psychologist at the University of Toronto by the name of Jordan Peterson, who has become quite famous online recently for standing in opposition to changes to the Human Rights Code in Ontario, Canada, that have really direct relevance to him as a professor. And he's been on many different podcasts, Joe Rogan, Dave Rubin, Gadsat, I think. So many people who you may also listen to have interviewed him. And he is actually, as I say at the beginning of this interview, the most requested guest I have had at this point by all of you. I can't tell you how many people have emailed me or tweeted at me demanding that I have Jordan on the podcast. And it's really in anticipation of us not talking about free speech, but about his beliefs about religion and its importance, the connection between religious truth and scientific truth, the importance of mythology. All of this is stuff that has come out in his other interviews, which many atheists and secularists have found both perplexing and inspiring. I've seen many atheists say that this, Jordan is giving the first construal of religion that I find hard to grapple with, that is interesting, that seems morally important and intellectually honest.
Jordan
so
B.
many of
Peterson,
you
he's
wanted to get the two of us together so that we could presumably butt heads on these topics. So I did invite Jordan on the podcast, and we're about to hear that conversation. And I am, as I say at the end, going to rely on all of you to figure out what happened. Because from my point of view, we got bogged down
Sam
on
Harris is
a very narrow point of more than just philosophical interest. We got bogged down on what it means to say that something is true or not. And to my eye, we didn't take that analysis very far because we immediately hit rather significant impediment and difference of opinion about what is entailed there.
Really
and I just couldn't
so.
get Jordan to agree on some facts that seem so basic to me that I was uncomfortable moving forward on other topics until we ironed that out. And it took more than 2 hours to get to a point where I thought, well, this is a good stopping point. We will see whether, based on the public reception to this, whether it is useful to move on to talk about morality and myth and religion and all the rest. I wanted to be my best self for the rest of that conversation. And I was running out of energy and patience there. So I decided to pull the reins. You now have 2 hours of me and Jordan butting heads on a variety of topics related to scientific epistemology, for lack of a better word. Please judge for yourselves how we did and what was going on there. It's not absolutely clear to me what we disagree about, but you'll hear me attempt to push really as hard as I could to get some answers there, and I really don't feel that I got them. So the fault could absolutely be mine, and I will rely on you to inform me of that. So I don't know where this is best done, perhaps on Reddit, but somebody bring my attention to what gets said here, if anything useful gets said in response to this podcast. These are all experiments in conversation. Now I bring you another one. Please enjoy my conversation with Jordan Peterson. I'm here with Jordan Peterson. Jordan, thanks for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, listen, you have the distinction of being, I think, without question, the person who my listeners most requested that I talk to. So,
we already heard that, man. We already heard you say that, man. Oh, wait, I'm supposed to register that it's changed because of the intonation, because of the read, because of the natural convention of understanding other humans, especially English-speaking humans that say such things in such ways.
Congratulations. People really want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, well, I think they want to hear what we both have to say. So, and hopefully we can manage that in a way that works out real well. That would be good as far as I'm concerned.
Actually, I'm very hopeful we'll have an interesting conversation here. I think you seem to suddenly be everywhere on the internet and even on many other podcasts. I think we should talk briefly about the reasons why you've suddenly become so visible, but I don't think we should spend a lot of time on them because I think that's territory where you and I almost fully converge, and I think that's not what people are most interested in having us talk about. But to just get people up to speed with what's been happening with you and why you've been so visible all of a sudden, let's talk briefly about the free speech issues, the gender pronoun issues, what's happening in Canada around this bill C-16 and the gender provision in the Ontario Human Rights Code. Just bring us up to speed there. And I think we should spend probably no more than 10 minutes or so there, and then we'll move on to areas where I may not fully agree.
10 minutes would be plenty. Yeah. Canada moved at the federal level to institute some legislation that, on the surface of it, seems more or less in keeping with the extension of human rights protection to different groups that's been occurring, say, over the last 30 to 50 years. This time they extended protection to gender identity and gender expression. The first problem with that, although by no means the worst problem, is that gender expression is not a group. And as far as I can tell from reading the Ontario Human Rights Commission website policies, which the federal government announced that the provisions of Bill C-16 would be interpreted within, you can now provisionally be prosecuted under the hate crime legislation federally for crime.
I'm not actually certain why I chose this particular thing to jump on. Seems rather like just me trying to extend a harping. Not need it, but let's just keep going.
Criticizing someone's choice of fashion, and I'm not being cynical about that. That's the Ontario Human Rights Commission policies describe gender expression as the manner in which people present themselves through such, while doing everyday activities like shopping, through their choice of clothes and dress. And the idea that requires protection of that magnitude, well, I think it's if you keep extending rights, all you do is weaken them. Rights are one person's rights are another person's responsibilities. And anyways, that's not the worst of it. The worst of it is that the code, the Ontario provisions, which are like lurking behind the federal law and are already law in Ontario, require the use of these so-called preferred pronouns if someone requests them. And I have a variety of objections to that. The most fundamental of which is I believe that the manufactured pronouns, the Z and the Zer and the 50 sort of variants of those are...
Just for a moment, describe what you're referring to there, because I think even among my audience, this is an arcane topic. What are these manufactured pronouns?
Well, it's dogma, I would say, among the radical left that gender is a social construct and that there are multiple variants of gender.
So now he's going to describe his argument against the left on political terms, which I think is, once again, it's a generalization. But here he goes.
Gender identity. And some of those don't fit neatly into male-female classifications. The legislation says that people can inhabit any position on that spectrum or not be on the spectrum at all between male and female, which, of course, I find that particular claim essentially incomprehensible. Anyways, the theory is that people who are non-binary, which is the terminology, are entitled to be referred to by pronouns other than he or she, which include they, which would, I suppose, be the most moderate compromise.
Right. Okay. So right there, as far as the whole pronoun thing, like I agree. Like I like that he's saying, that Jordan is saying, hey, that should be the most moderate of compromises, meaning at the very least there should be a category for other.
And then a host of other pronouns that have appeared basically out of the void over the last 10 years, including words like Z and Zer and her, which would be HIR, and Zem. And there's like 70 different sets of them.
Right.
And there's no agreement whatsoever on which ones should be used. And none of them have entered popular parlance because they are bad solutions to the problem. And the legislation nonetheless necessitates their use. And this is the first time that Canadian government has moved to make a particular kind of speech content mandatory. There are certain limitations on speech, although not very many of them. But this is the first time out of the commercial realm that the actual contents of speech have been made mandatory. And my particular objection to this is that I believe, and I think I have good evidence for believing that these made-up pronouns, these manufactured pronouns, are part of the lexicon of the radical postmodern / neo-Marxist left, and it's part of their general agenda to occupy the linguistic territory that we use for common parlance. And I don't like their philosophy. In fact, I regard it as reprehensible, to say the least. And because of that, I'm not willing to cede linguistic territory.
Just letting
certainly
you
not
know,
by
it's not,
being forced to use ideologically saturated as an ideologically saturated lexicon.
Hey, thanks so much.
So I said I wouldn't do it. I made a video.
Have a good night.
3 videos actually complaining about, let's say, criticizing Bill C-16 in the background legislation, which also, by the way, makes employers responsible for any word that their employees utter that causes anyone any offense, intended or unintended, whether or not the employer.
Okay, I agree with them all this. Let's not put it into law that way. Maybe a third, maybe the third, and that's about it. And then
knows that utterance occurred, which seems to me a little bit on the draconian side, but I think is in keeping with the same philosophy, which is by no means pro-business. And there are other elements of what's going on in the background that are equally reprehensible. Ontario has set up social justice tribunals. That's their technical name, which gives you some insight into their purpose and into their staffing. One of those is the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and they basically decided that they have the right to suspend normal legal and judicial procedure, and that they can more or less ascribe to themselves whatever powers they choose, and that's written in their policy statements. And so I'm not very happy about any of that. And so also at the same time, the University of Toronto made it mandatory for their human resources employees to undergo unconscious bias training against racism, which is also something, again, that I don't believe the science for documenting unconscious bias is anywhere near advanced to the point where it should be used as a diagnostic indicator of the potential prejudice of entire classes of people. I don't think there's any question that the tool is too weak to do that, certainly by the standards of appropriate psychometric tests. And there's certainly no evidence that these training programs that are popping up anywhere do any good with regards to prejudice, and a fair bit that they actually make it worse.
Right.
So anyways, I made 2 videos, posted them on my YouTube channel. Mostly I did it very late at night, and I was just trying to think this stuff through, to get it straight in my head and to lay out the argument. And well, the response to them was absolutely insane, really. There's 180 separate newspapers articles written, and 2 protests at the University of Toronto, and I received 2 warning letters from the administration and a letter of censure from a number of my fellow academics and postdocs and graduate students at the University of Toronto. And it was news, literally. Well, yesterday, the Toronto Star published like a 3,000-word biography of me, and Toronto Life, which is, I suppose, our equivalent to New Yorker, although not in the same league, is going to publish a 5,000-word bio on me. And and then I've talked to Joe Rogan and a whole bunch of other people for podcasts. It's been crazy. But the reason for that is because I made something that was bubbling underneath the surface of our culture, and was certainly bubbling under the surface of yours at the last election. I made it concrete and put forth my objections in an articulate manner, and it struck a chord with people, and it's actually been news not only in Canada, but it stretched its tentacles down to the States and certainly into Western Europe and Australia, New Zealand. And I'm being interviewed in South Africa this week, and it's been like being in a ship in a storm, and it's dumbfounding.
I can imagine it's been stressful, I'm sure. Now, is your job at the University of Toronto in jeopardy? Is that the kind of communication you've received? Or
well, I received 2 warning letters basically asking me to stop talking about this, based on the idea that even mentioning the fact that I might not use these pronouns probably contravened the Ontario Human Rights Code and also the University Code of Conduct, although hypothetically the University's Code of Conduct is dominated by protection for free speech. And so they kind of did the typical HR thing and got the lawyers on it, and they're conservative. And, they warned me twice. I didn't stop talking about it, but then the university was roundly criticized by a number of Canada's major journalists, including a coalition of 100 newspapers. And they got a lot of bad press. The press actually turned in support of me quite hard about 2 weeks after this started, when they started to investigate what I was talking about and found out that I actually that my claims weren't exaggerated by any stretch of the imagination. And so
I've seen that criticism. I've paid attention to what you've been saying on this topic, and some people have said that you are at least mistaken about the legal implications of these changes in the law or these rulings. But it seems to me the one thing you can't be mistaken about is the treatment you have received thus far in response to your saying you won't use these pronouns.
If the university lawyers hadn't been convinced that I was correct in my interpretation, they wouldn't have sent out a warning that I should stop doing it because it might be illegal. That's the best piece of proof supporting my position that the law has this draconian element, because they didn't send me those letters incautiously. They had their lawyers review the damn legislation and then came to the same conclusion that I did.
Right.
And the 2 lawyers who have been making these claims that this legislation is far more innocuous than I'm making it out to be are both social activist lawyers. And so they have a serious agenda. And one of them, Brenda Kosman, told me, that I wouldn't go to jail, although that is a possibility, despite what she said, because the law does have that power. All that would happen is that essentially I could be financially ruined. It's like, that's not draconian at all,
Yeah.
So, and the Ontario Human Rights Commission has managed to demolish lots of people's lives. It's a kangaroo court, in my opinion, and a very dangerous one at that.
One thing we absolutely agree about is that freedom of speech is not just one among many different values. It really is a master value, because it's the only corrective to human stupidity. It's the only mechanism by which we can improve our society. And in fact, it's the value that allows us to improve our other values through conversation.
Yes, that's exactly right. It's the fundamental value. It's exactly right. It's the fundamental value upon which our entire cultural edifice is predicated. And I believe that that's part of the reason why the postmodern radicals in particular are opposed to freedom of speech, because they don't believe in God.
Okay, so there's this idea that postmodernists of all people are against freedom of speech, right? So he's going to tell us what we can't categorize, Jordan B. Peterson, in one instance, and then he's going to tell us what we, what not only he's going to just categorize postmodernists that are saying, oh, they're against freedom of speech, instead of really narrowing it down to whom he's speaking of in that other half, that other hemisphere of his mind. It's like he's only got like everything I think, and then the left, postmodern Marxists.
Dialogue. They don't believe in rationality. They don't believe that groups who have different orientations of power can discuss their differences in a civilized manner and reach resolution, because that isn't how they see the world. That's how modernists see the world. But postmodernists don't believe any of that, and they seriously don't believe it. It's not a facade or it's a very entrenched part of their philosophy. So that's partly why they don't like to, why they block speakers who oppose their views from campus, and why they're perfectly willing to shut them down, and why they don't, why they have no platforming policies, which is basically the decision not to let anyone who holds alternative views have a forum, even, and it's because they don't believe in rational dialogue and the possibility of reaching a solution through it.
There's something, at least on its face, so wrong-headed about this pronoun campaign that it makes me feel like I don't understand something about it.
Well, you don't. There's something more nefarious lurking at the bottom of it. And you see, in Canada, I know that you're not a social constructionist. I know that you, like Steven Pinker, believe deeply that human behavior is profoundly influenced by its underlying biological substrate, which is another view that we share. But Canada has now written a social constructionist view of human identity into the law. So it's illegal, it's illegal, at least in principle, to claim that biology has anything to do with gender identity, or that biology and gender identity have anything to do with gender expression, or that any of those three have anything to do with social orientation in a causal manner.
Right.
And that's written into the law. So what the social justice warriors are going to do next is to go after the biologists. They did that with E.O. Wilson already back 30 years ago, and they're doing it in Germany right now. But there's an anti-psychiatry scholarship established at the Ontario Institute for the Study of Education, which is a particularly pernicious institution. And it's no longer obvious what sort of claims you can make as a scientist about the relationship between biology and sex, or the hypothetically separate gender identity.
Right.
So that's the worst of the lot, because normally governments shy away from implementing a particular ideology, especially one that's discredited, which certainly the radical social constructionist position is, to make that a fundamental part of the law. And that's definitely happened. And that'll unfold in a particularly nasty way over the next 10 years.
Ideology aside, there's just a difference between...
social constructionism is not considered a lesser field of study than anything that's considered innate. Sociology, studying of cities and groups of people, studying the psychology of groups. It all bears on that school of thought. So he's what a lambast.
A positive and negative injunction. So I can ask you to stop doing an infinite number of things, and that imposes no energy cost on you. I can say, stop using the N-word. It offends me, right? Or stop littering, or stop driving your car on the sidewalk, right? And you can not do those things, and it takes no time not to do those things. It takes no cognitive overhead not to do those things. But I can't ask you to do an infinite number of things. I can't tell you to pick up all the litter you see everywhere, because you spend the rest of your life doing that, and you still would fail to comply with the injunction. And asking people to learn a new list of gender pronouns and then live in a state of vigilance to see that they apply them correctly. This is a positive injunction, and you're demanding that people do something. For me to demand that people start using a word of my own invention, or if I say I want to be addressed by a 16-digit number and I'm going to be offended if you get the number wrong, this is imposing a cost on people.
I'm going to be offended, and I'm going to take you to court, and you could be charged under hate speech, and I could change that pronoun in an hour if I want, or tomorrow, or the next day on a whim. Because that's also part of the legislation, because that covers the people who are so-called gender fluid. And so they have the right to transform their identity according to their subjective whim, I would say. Because the legislation also assumes that this identity that's being protected so hard has no grounding in biology, and it's only subjectively determined. So they actually go beyond social constructionism to make it essentially solipsistic. It's the only thing that determines your identity is the way that you feel at that time. So that's an unbelievably poverty-stricken notion of identity, which at minimum is something that you have to negotiate with other people. I mean, it has to be functional, and you have to negotiate with other people. So, it's not understandable unless you look underneath it. And that's why I was objecting, because I think it's a perfectly reasonable manifestation of the postmodernism that's nested in neo-Marxism. It's perfectly in keeping with their stated aims. So, and those aims are not, if you are an admirer of Western culture, at least the good parts of Western culture, then you're the enemy of the postmodern / neo-Marxists. They're opposed to absolutely everything you believe.
We're going to get into that territory, I would imagine, by another route. So I don't think there's more to say here, because I think we probably agree about everything. I'm obviously not a lawyer. I'm certainly not a Canadian lawyer. So if there's any way in which we're getting some of the legal details wrong, I offer a blank apology. But in terms of the belief that biology doesn't significantly determine gender or sexuality, or the wisdom and utility of inventing new identities and demanding that everyone keep track of them in perpetuity, I mean, I think you and I more or less totally overlap there. So I think we should just move on.
You better not come to Canada and have that discussion.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's been bizarre to see some of these encounters you've been having, but this is why you've suddenly become so visible to people, and it's very interesting to see that this is how it's manifesting. But we have bigger, deeper, more perennial fish to fry. I think we need to talk about religion and science and atheism and the foundations of morality, things like meaning, your interest in mythology, your fear of nihilism. Let's get into all that. I think you and I share some fundamental concerns, and we feel a similar kind of urgency. I think it expresses itself in slightly different ways and different ways of talking, but we feel an urgency that our fellow human beings get certain questions right. But I think we probably disagree about some fundamental matters, and whether those will be, in the end, a matter of semantic difference and can be pushed to the periphery or not. I think that remains to be seen, but I think it'll be interesting to talk about these things.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I thought I might do is pursue the tack that you're not enough of a Darwinian, which I thought would be quite comical. Because I've often thought the same about Richard Dawkins, but I would like to point out some of the things, because I've read a fair bit of what you've written now. It's not by no means comprehensively, but I think I've come to understand your central claims, and of course they're very powerful because you're an advocate for materialist rationalism, essentially, I would say, with a bit of spirituality on the side. And materialist rationalism is an unbelievably powerful tool, and it's very coherent.
Materially rationalism.
I address the topic with trepidation because
material he's calling it material, what do you call it, rationalism? Didn't say that, but he named it, and I thought he's talking about metaphysical naturalism is what I thought, how I would refer to Sam Harris's approach. But as a rationalist, he's still also a rationalist.
It was certainly the case that the philosophical doctrine to which you adhere has transformed the world and has posed an unbelievably potent threat, let's say. That's one way of challenge, that's better, to traditional views of the world. So, but there are some things that we share in common that maybe we could start with. So, and you tell me if I've got any of this wrong.
I think a good starting point is this. It actually leads directly into this claim about not being Darwinian enough, but it's the concept of truth. I've heard you say in a variety of ways that religious truth isn't scientific truth. And the difference here is that science tells you what things are, and that religion tells you how you should act. So let's talk about that. And I think that does connect to this Darwinian concern of yours.
Yeah, that's a good. I'm going to approach that obliquely to begin with. So let me throw a couple of propositions at you, and I know that you don't accept Hume's distinction between an is and an ought. That you're willing to challenge that, and fair enough. It's a reasonable thing to try to challenge, although it's quite difficult. But that doesn't mean it's impossible.
Yeah, maybe I'm not in the mood to argue.
I've been thinking a lot about the essential philosophical contradiction between a Newtonian worldview, which I would say your view is nested inside, and a Darwinian worldview, because those views are not the same. They're seriously not the same.
Okay.
I mean, the Darwinian view, as the American pragmatists recognized, so that was William James and his crowd, recognized almost immediately, was a form of pragmatism. And the pragmatists claimed that the truth of a statement or process can only be adjudicated with regards to its efficiency in attaining its aim. And so their idea was that truths are always bounded because we're ignorant, and every action that you undertake that's goal-directed has an internal ethic embedded in it, and the ethic is the claim that if what you do works, then it's true enough, and that's all you can ever do. And what Darwin did, as far as the pragmatists were concerned, was to put forth the following proposition, which was that it was impossible for a finite organism to keep up with a multi-dimensionally transforming landscape, environmental landscape, let's say. And so the best that could be done was to generate random variants, kill most of them because they were wrong, and let the others that were correct enough live long enough to propagate, whereby the same process occurs again. So it's not like the organism is a solution to the problem of the environment. The organism is a very bad partial solution to an impossible problem. Okay, and the thing about that is that you can't get outside that claim. I can't see how you can get outside that claim if you're a Darwinian, because the Darwinian claim is that the only way to ensure adaptation to the unpredictably transforming environment is through random mutation, essentially, and death, and that there is no truth claim.
Okay, that's I mean, there's other ways to read Darwinianism than to assume that his description of how Darwin is describing natural selection is like accepted by most evolutionary biologists, right? And it's not to say that philosophically he doesn't have a point about the random aspects of natural selection. Is that he's going to later on parry. He's already putting Darwin as a pragmatist, as if there's a utility in what Darwin did. And I do think that he's not talking about an organism within changing populations, and that natural selection is considered like an inductive process of thinking. And then they're comparing it to Newton, Darwin to Newton, right? Darwin's speaking about biological trends, ideas of experiential forms of knowledge, more like ontologically based knowledges, where Newton talks of mathematics, accepted symbols with limited function that only have other functions or other relationships or other definitions, very discrete categoricals in math and mathematics. And so the result of the logic system within math is a different type of truth than analogies and words that traverse over what people believe they're seeing in biology, knowing that they're ignorant about almost an infinite amount of what it is they're seeing, but nevertheless a narrowed amount, a specific finite amount of facts that they do know about the biosphere, that they put claim to know, or that they assume to carry on further knowledge claims.
Claim whatsoever that can surpass that. And so then that brings me to the next point, if you don't mind, and then I'll shut up and let you talk. So I was thinking about that, and I thought about that for a long time. So it seems to me there's a fundamental contradiction between Darwin's claims and the Newton deterministic claim and the materialist objective claim that science is true in some final sense. And so I was thinking of two things that I read. One was the attempt by the KGB back in the late part of the 20th century to hybridize smallpox and Ebola, and then aerosol it so it can be used on for mass destruction. And the thing is that that's a perfectly valid scientific enterprise as far as I'm concerned. It's an interesting problem. You might say, well, you shouldn't divorce it from the surrounding politics. Well, that's exactly the issue: is how much can be divorced, and from what. And then the second example is, a scientist with any sense would say, well, our truths are incontrovertible. Let's look at the results, and we could say, well, let's look at the hydrogen bomb. If you want a piece of evidence that our theories about the subatomic structure of reality are accurate, you don't really have to look much farther than a hydrogen bomb. It's a pretty damn potent demonstration. And so then I was thinking, well, imagine for a moment that the invention of the hydrogen bomb did lead to the outcome, which we were also terrified about during the Cold War, which would have been, for the sake of argument, either the total elimination of human life or perhaps the total elimination of life. Now, the latter possibility is quite unlikely, but the former one certainly wasn't beyond comprehension. And so then I would say, well, the proposition that the universe is best conceptualized as subatomic particles was true enough to generate a hydrogen bomb, but it wasn't true enough to stop everyone from dying. And therefore, from a Darwinian perspective, it was an insufficient pragmatic proposition and was therefore, in some fundamental sense, wrong.
Well, okay, but now what he's ascribing a telos or a directionality to Darwin's claims of natural selection, it would seem, as if there had to be some utility in the theory itself instead of an open-ended theory. So out of the gate, I think the way he's framing Darwin, the way he believes Darwin sits within the constraints of his influence in history and in whatever philosophical comparison Jordan Peterson wants to make between pragmatism and as par excellence in Darwinianism as it relates to Newtonianism, right? And it's just interesting that that's the basis of where he's pinning the argument. But I don't see what he's saying as being I don't agree on where he's positioning it.
And perhaps it was wrong because of what it left out. Maybe it's wrong in the Darwinian sense to reduce the complexity of being to a material substrate and forget about the surrounding context. So, well, those are two examples. And so you can have a way at that if you want.
Yeah, okay. So there are a few issues here that I think we need to pull apart. I think that the basic issue here, and where I disagree with you, is you seem to be equivocating on the nature of truth here. You're using truth in two different senses and finding a contradiction that I don't, in fact, think exists. So let's talk about pragmatism and Darwinism briefly for a second. So I spent a lot of time in the thicket of pragmatism because I was a student of Richard Rorty's at Stanford, and I took every class he taught and just basically did nothing but argue with him about pragmatism. So I'm very familiar with this way of viewing the concept of scientific truth. I'm not so sure our audience is deeply schooled in this. So briefly, let me just add a little to how you describe pragmatism. And this is, Rorty was one of the leading lights of pragmatism, as you know. So his view may be slightly idiosyncratic, but it was fairly well subscribed among pragmatists, and he was influenced by Dewey, and he linked his view in some similar ways to a Darwinian conception of truth, but not quite the way you're doing it, seems to me. In any case, the idea is that we can never stand outside of human conversation and talk about reality as it is or truth as it is. We never come into contact with naked truth. All we have is our conversation and our tool.
Okay, so he's going to come from this line of thought. We can never step outside of it. And then later on, notice how he makes a claim almost like if there were no consciousnesses around anymore in the universe, that somehow facts would remain in the universe. To suppose the idea that he did in fact step outside of his consciousness to come to this notion of the conclusion about what Sam Harris is going to define as true, right? So now he's going to push back on truth to eventually pull back out of consciousness. But the argument is, what is it to speak about any relationships, adjectives, verbs, or nouns about anything in the absent as a fact, as what we call a fact, as our dictation and our history and the etymology of what a fact is would also just be non-speakable, non-usable, non-describable, because there's no one around to describe it, to sense it, to perform the function of calling something a something, and that some relational aspect to it is a fact. In lieu of that absence, what is his claim?
Of augmenting
As a prelude
conversation, scientific instruments and otherwise. And all we really have, the currency of truth, is whatever successfully passes muster in a conversation. So I say something that I think is true, and it seems to work for you. We're playing a similar language game, and some people disagree. They criticize what we are claiming to be true, and we go back and forth. And all we ever have is this kind of ever-expanding horizon line of successful conversations that allow us to do things technologically that are very persuasive. So as you say, we can build hydrogen bombs. And so the conversation about the structure of the atom, at the very least, the conversation about the amount of energy hidden in the otherwise nebulous structure of an atom, that becomes, very well grounded in facts that we all can agree are intersubjectively true.
Yeah, well, that seems to weaken the claim that it's just within language, which is kind of a postmodern claim too, because it's very difficult for me to believe that the hydrogen bomb is what it is just because we agree what it is in conversation. It immediately reflects a world outside of language. That doesn't mean we get permanent and omniscient access.
Like, okay, he's going to say a world outside of language, and I know he's referring to the objective world, right? That which you can reference, the referent, right? He's not going to use that term, the referent, right? Because, well, he doesn't. It's not his vocabulary term.
Access to that world, but it's more than language as far as, so maybe I'm misunderstanding Rorty or
I think you are understanding him. He will say that, again, all we ever have is our effort to organize the way the world seems to us with concepts and language, and we just have successful iterations of that and unsuccessful ones. And a hydrogen bomb explosion, no matter how big, assuming we survive it, still falls within this empirical context of an evolving language game. And I agree with you that it does connect with postmodernism in a way that is decidedly unhelpful. And Rorty was a fan.
Empirical context, right? Which is fine to say. Like, hey, the scientific modes of and ability to agree upon different chemistry and nuclear physics or physics facts that yielded the atomic bomb was done by peers, by people that agreed upon what the definitions and what the facts were within that. So in response to Jordan P. Peterson, it's not outside of language, it's objective within language, like a torus or a donut's having a center, right? Not the outside of a donut or the outside of a non-donut, right? So that's where Peterson makes his error.
And of Derrida and Foucault, and I remember walking out of Derrida's lecture at Stanford, I literally had to climb over the bodies of the credulous who were sitting in the aisles listening to the great man speak, and he didn't speak a single intelligible sentence as far as I recall.
Well, that's obvious.
Well, and see, and okay, so Derrida being, French is his primary language, to know that he had fun during lecture interviews in the U.S. because of some of the constraints that were given on him, and then just to have Sam here say, well, I went to a lecture and he was entirely incoherent, right? That doesn't, Sam, you know better than that, doesn't exclude any coherence that you might find in his text work, because you found what he was speaking of in the moment unintelligible. That's problematic right there.
Yes, just because you don't have the profundity to understand, a postmodern French neo-Marxist intellectual.
I don't. But to get back to some of your claims here, there's this claim you're making about the Darwinian basis of truth and knowledge, that there really is just survival, right? There's just biological change selected against by an environment, and there's what works in that context, what is pragmatic in that context biologically, and there's what doesn't, and what doesn't gets you killed.
Yep.
Now, obviously, that picture of how we got here is something that I agree with.
Right.
But our conception of truth, and our conception of truth in general, and scientific truth specifically, and even of Darwinian evolution within that subset of truth claims, that is not functioning by merely Darwinian principles. And this just goes to...
Right, but that could be an objection to its validity. Like, there's no reason to assume, and don't get me wrong, like, I'm perfectly happy with science. I'm a scientist. And
really?
But there's no reason to assume
what you call yourself?
that our view of the world, our current scientific view of the world, isn't flawed or incomplete in some manner that will prove fundamentally fatal to us.
As a working assumption, we can decide not to worry too much about that, and that's fine. But yes, I agree, and more fundamental than that, and I think this is the accurate version of the claim you're making. This is something that I spoke about on another podcast with Max Tegmark, a physicist from MIT. There is just the fact that within the Darwinian conception of how we got here, there's no reason to believe that our cognitive faculties have evolved to put us in error-free contact with reality. That's not how they evolved. I mean, we did not evolve to be perfect mathematicians or perfect logical operators or perfect conceivers of scientific reality at the very small, subatomic level, or at the very large cosmic level, or at the very old cosmological level. We are designed by the happenstance of evolution to function within a very narrow band of light intensities and physical parameters. The things we are designed to do very well are, recognize the facial expressions of apes just like ourselves, and to throw objects in parabolic arcs within 100 meters and all of that. And so the fact that we are able to succeed to the degree that we have in creating a vision of scientific truth and the structure of the cosmos at large that radically exceeds those narrow parameters, that is a kind of miracle. It's an amazing fact about us that seems not to be true, remotely true, of any other species we know about. And that's something to be celebrated, and it's a lot of fun to see how far we can get in that direction. But I would grant you that there are no guarantees as we move forward in that space. And in fact, we should be skeptical about how easy we can have it in this space.
Yes.
One thing that Max Tegmark said, which I thought was fascinating, he goes one step further than I had tended to go along these lines, where he said that we should expect, as just based on accepting the logic of evolution, we should expect that we will have our common sense intuitions frequently and really incessantly violated by what we discover to be true about the nature of reality through science.
Yeah, what we discover scientifically to be true about the nature of reality. Yeah, well, so partly I made the case that I made to indicate to you and the listeners where I'm starting from in some sense. So I think it's not unreasonable to assume that you're making the metaphysical claim in some sense that Darwinian truth is nested inside Newtonian truth.
I wouldn't call it Newtonian. Let me just change your words a little bit, but it may be a distinction without a difference here. But I would oppose realism, scientific realism, and even moral realism. I consider myself a moral realist. I think there are right and wrong answers to moral questions. I would oppose realism with pragmatism. And the core tenet of realism for me is that it's possible for everyone to be mistaken. It's possible for there to be a consensus around truths that are in fact not true.
Yeah.
It's possible to not know what you're missing. There's a horizon of cognition beyond which we can't currently see, and we may be right or wrong about what we think exceeds our grasp at the moment. And so that's something that the pragmatist can't say. The pragmatist has to locate truth always within the context of existing conversations, existing consensus. And in this Darwinian conception of truth, you are saying that there's just what works for us biologically, pragmatically, as apes on Earth now. And there's no larger context of truth claims that we can make that situates that in a larger sphere where you can intelligibly say that everyone is wrong about something.
Well, it's complicated. I wouldn't say I'm saying exactly that. I certainly don't agree with the language game part of it. And see, if you think of the Darwinian process as something you can't escape, like there's no outside of it. And partly the reason for that is that you're just too damn ignorant to get outside of it in any transcendent manner. Now you might say, well, you can do that to some degree with science, and I'm not going to argue with that.
But before you move on, let me just understand the claim, because it seems to me we are outside of it in every respect where you want to emphasize the Darwinian component of it. So we're outside of the implications that certain phenotypes would have killed you outright 5,000 years ago, whereas now we have a civilizational mechanism to protect those people. So if you're wearing eyeglasses and you are able to function just as well as your neighbor who's got perfect vision, you're out of a Darwinian paradigm there. It doesn't matter that you're wearing eyeglasses, right? On 1,000 points, we can make that same observation. And therefore, more or less everything we care about has followed along those lines. I mean, so just the fact that we are, one of the greatest gains we are attempting to make, although we have done it imperfectly thus far, is to outgrow tribalism in all its forms, right? So we recognize that tribalism is not the best, moral bedrock. And yet, in a Darwinian paradigm, tribalism is really the only game in town. And so we stand outside of Darwinian logic, both morally and intellectually, all the time. Now, are you denying that? What am I confused about?
I'm calling that into question. I'm not necessarily denying it, and I'm certainly not presuming that, that what I'm saying is right, because I'm trying to solve another problem at the same time. But you see, the thing about the scientific viewpoint is that it leaves certain things out. And it leaves out what it doesn't know, obviously, although the same might be said for any other system of belief, and should be. But it also looks at the world in a particular way. For example, it strips the world of its subjectivity. And it may be that that's a fatal error. Now, that doesn't mean that it stops science from being unbelievably useful as a tool. But I think of science as a tool rather than as a description of reality. And, that's where we differ. And it's fair that we differ. It isn't obvious which of those two positions could be held to be correct. Because, you could say that the more we learn about the objective world, in your realist manner, the higher the probability that we'll survive. And it's conceivable that those things are aligned in that manner. But it's also inconceivable that they're not. And I'm wary of that because radical changes produce unintended consequences. And, we've lived relatively successfully as primates for, a couple of dozen.
Radical changes produce unintended consequences, as if very pragmatic, understood, mundane things didn't have potentially radical consequences, right? So, like swerving on a highway has potentially radical consequences, but just changing lanes, now that's just mundane. That doesn't have radical consequences.
Dozen million years, and we're transforming things pretty damn rapidly. One potential outcome is that in 500 years, we're more machine than human, and that we're not really human at all in any realistic sense. And I can't necessarily see that as a, you could claim that that's a positive outcome, but it isn't necessarily that it's a positive outcome. So you're assuming that there is an alignment between the two.
No, I'm not doing that. I think, and I'm getting a little confused about what you're claiming. So let me just go over that ground you just sketched just to get myself on track. So it seems to me that you're saying that
sound like to me like he's saying in a few we're going to be more machine than human, and that the claim of being human would be something that wouldn't even be under question or something to that effect.
The reductio ad absurdum of a Darwinian conception of knowledge would be if we ever learned certain truths that got us all killed, well, then that would prove that these things weren't true, or that this was an intellectual dead end.
Yeah, they weren't true enough, I would say.
I mean, two things here. One is that there's nothing about my conception of science that discounts the reality.
Okay, they're probably going to start fighting about truth. I think they do, right? As if they won't index different types of true. Like when one is shooting an arrow, right? Sinning means not hitting the target, right? But if one shoots and doesn't hit the bullseye, right, they're still shot something through time at something, right? And so that's a type of truth, the truth of humanity existing, the truth of the individual prospering, getting through, getting over stuff, getting past projects. That's a type of truth. Then there's another kind of truth that comes with deduction or induction or logical function or propositional analysis or abduction relative to one's epistemological grounding or footing. And then philosophical truths, meta, what does it mean? And analogic dialogue, like, oh, let's describe what that event could have been like in more of a phenomenological description, as opposed to, epistemology and ontology, as if those three are tripart.
Or the significance of subjectivity. So I understand what you're saying when you say that science or materialism leaves out subjectivity.
I understand.
I've against that conception of science. So you have cognitive materialism in me, in my mind.
Well, do you think that that's true of your views on consciousness? Because that's another place where I say we disagree.
You have you think that, but I think there's subjective dimension of reality. I've said that consciousness is the one thing in the illusion. It's the only thing that you can be absolutely sure.
Your claim that you make better that's related to that. I think the one thing, and this is, I think, part of your fundamental ethical metaphysics, and it's a point on which we agree, I believe, you are very concerned with, let's call it pain, for a better word. And, one of the conclusions that I've read.
It's into pain. Basically, he's saying the fact of consciousness, it's what's there, right? He's basically applying I think, the Cartesian, I think, therefore I am, or I am, therefore I am, right? The fact of my being evidences itself. But that would be a phenomenological type of knowledge, right? Like the periphery of phenomenology. Epistemology would require that there would be some sort of verifying outside context to consciousness that one could reach through and actually verify that, in fact, that wasn't a unique or independent or individuated consciousness.
Which is, I think, in keeping with what you just said, because it necessarily involves consciousness. But so let's call consciousness a reality. But then I would say that the most undeniable form of consciousness is acute agony, because no one doubts that. Not if you watch them act, and that's one of the criteria by which I judge whether or not someone believes something. So if people act out something uncontrollably, then I'm convinced that they believe it, regardless of what they think they believe. And I think it's for that reason that so many religious systems start with the same metaphysic, which is life is suffering. That's the ultimate reality.
If someone starts babbling, right, just starts babbling, or bounces their head off of a wall, then he believes that the behavior is never an action, it's never a theatrics, it's never a following, it's never a religious convention or some sort of behavior that's inculcated or becoming habitual in the organism. No. He just trusts it out of hand. Like, hey, that's systematic of a problem.